I am delighted to be joined by Isabel Thomas. Isabel is a science writer and children's author. She's written more than 180 books about science and nature for young audiences, which have been translated into more than 20 languages. She also writes features for children's science magazines and creates content for science outreach projects to inspire children from diverse backgrounds to pursue science careers. Welcome, Isabel. Great to have you as part of this discussion.
Oh, it's lovely to be with you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, so we're going to start with 6 opening questions. Then we'll go into your 3 top tips. And then we have 1 question submitted by a member of the ISN community, which would be great to get your thoughts on. And
Thank
so,
you.
yeah, moving straight into my first question. Why should educators think about writing or becoming an author?
I think it's a brilliant background for going into writing. I mean, I think of myself as a non-fiction author. I've always thought of myself as an educator, except that I'm working mainly in print, but I also do a lot of live workshops as well, as you said in the intro. So I've always seen right from the beginning when I was working in textbook publishing that experience in teaching is just the ideal background to begin writing for young audiences, and obviously especially educational and academic texts. First of all, you're spending so much time with your target audience as a teacher, and you have an amazing understanding of not only the curriculum itself, what they're studying, but the level of background knowledge they bring at each age, and also what children are interested in beyond the curriculum. So you've got all these ideas at your hand to kind of engage them, and you already know how to make a strong connection when you're teaching. And you've also got a really good idea of areas that are really tricky to teach, or areas that children are naturally very interested in, or places where there are gaps in the market where better educational texts are needed. So there's so much as an educator that you can bring into developing ideas and writing fantastical educational books. And vice versa too, there's also a lot to gain as an educator. You know, writing a book or an article about a subject is just a fantastic way to deepen your subject knowledge and to explore lots of new aspects of that subject that you might then be able to bring to your teaching.
Brilliant. And how easy is the journey to getting published?
Well, everyone's journey is completely different, so there's no kind of one answer to that. My own background, my own introduction to publishing was really straight through university, and I began working in-house with an educational publisher. So at first I was a science graduate, and at first I was working on science and maths textbooks for a big textbook publisher, and then gradually sort of moved into non-fiction reference book publishing. So things aimed at school libraries, books a lot like this, kind of hardback, very subject focused books that you find lots of in school libraries. And this was kind of an apprenticeship in a way. And I did gain lots of useful experience. You know, as an editor, you often get hands-on with writing too. But the biggest thing it gave me was that it totally demystified the process of going into writing. You know, I saw firsthand that authors don't just magically churn out perfect prose the first time. And we weren't even choosing the authors because they had tons and tons of writing experience. So we were really looking at other qualities for these educational authors, things like deep subject knowledge and the kind of interest in the subject beyond their own classrooms, the kind of teachers that would naturally get involved in helping other teachers create resources, getting involved with exam boards and things like that, and had a really deep understanding of how new knowledge is scaffolded and introduced in their classroom, so they can obviously translate that into writing too. And I noticed that great authors also have a really good understanding of the pressures student teachers are under, and what sorts of things you can include in books and sort of other digital resources to make life easier in the classroom. And equally, you know, educators have an appreciation of what should be left out of a text as well, that often if you're just a subject expert coming into writing and you have no classroom experience, then you tend to want to kind of pack everything in, and you think books are kind of key. But obviously educators know there's so much going on in the classroom, and books and resources need to work around all of that. So that's something that I gain from working in-house and publishing, and obviously educators will bring from all their time in the classroom too. And the craft of writing itself is something that can be learned with practice and just gets better and better with time. So I think really, whatever background you're coming from, the key thing is just to start, start developing your ideas, start pitching them. Don't wait until you think you have this perfect polished manuscript that you've been working on for years and years. Just get out there, start pitching your ideas. Doesn't matter if you get turned down. First of all, just get your name and your CV, your covering letter into the hands of publishers, and then you'll see that all sorts of opportunities start to kind of arise.
And just a quick question off that, what does a pitch look like? So if someone's really interested in publishing their ideas and their insights and their expertise, how long should that be? Just a rough idea of what that process looks like of developing a pitch and a brief to send out.
Yeah, again, there's not hard and fast rules. You find that a lot of writing advice you see online just agonizes over exactly what format a pitch should be in, and that's really because it's actually hard to teach writing itself. It's just a matter of sitting down and sort of getting things done. So people tend to focus, I think, too much on exactly what a pitch should look like and trying to make it very perfect. Actually, no, you're writing stuff as part of your job all the time. You know how to write and communicate with professionals. So just a kind of simple, shortish, concise summary of what your idea is. Maybe with any sample text, maybe you've been already writing some resources in classroom and you want to kind of develop those into a text to share with other educators or even parents. And you can include a small sample of that with your letter. So just write a simple letter explaining what your background is and why you're so interested in writing, how you're in touch with your target audience, and give that kind of summary of your idea and a little bit of sample text, but keep it concise. You don't need to kind of talk on, and you don't need to sort of include lots of phrases about your passion for writing and so on. Just simple, straightforward communications. And as I say, if that particular idea doesn't chime with the publisher, or they've already got something similar in development, now your name and your background is with them and in their mind, so they're more likely then to reach out to you if they have other projects that would be suitable for you.
And how should potential authors figure out or think about who their audience is?
So I suppose if you were writing about nonfiction and say you were an expert in, I don't know, tortoises, you might think, I'm starting with tortoises, I need to figure out who is my audience. But I think with educational texts and the way that educational publishers work, it's the other way around. So the audience is the starting point, and that is who you think should be thinking from right from the start. It's not an afterthought. It will guide what you're going to write about, because you're identifying, what don't we have that we need, what don't readers have that they really need. So that's really your starting point. And so if I was an educator starting out writing for the first time, I would look first to the age group I understand best, and the subjects that I am most comfortable with, and begin there. And it can also really help if you spend lots of time looking at existing publications. So if you really, you're a biology teacher, you really want to write about tortoises, for example, look up as many books for young readers as you can find in that area. And you might start to notice that most are pitched at a particular age group, which suggests that they're either very popular with that age group, in which case publishers will be looking to publish new books on that topic every year, or they're really needed by educators for that age group, which is also a massive advantage. And it's not to say that you can't break the rules or bend the pattern there. For example, quantum physics, as we know, doesn't feature on any primary school curriculum, any elementary school curricula, but a quick Google will show you, pop up even books on quantum physics for babies. I mean, of course, obviously the real, you could argue the real audience there is adults, but it just shows you can make just about any subject work for any age group, if you think about it really hard. So a good example I can give you from my own career, I first studied evolution, I suppose, at secondary school, fairly late in my science education, and then in great detail at university when I was an undergraduate in human sciences and evolutionary biology. And I always kind of thought the classic story you learn as a teenager about the peppered moths and natural selection, would be so fantastic to help younger children explain, sort of understand the building blocks of evolution, if you like. So when the time was right, I pitched a picture book on the story of the peppered moth, and I wasn't sure how publishers would react to that, but one editor really saw the potential, and it became what's my best-selling book, which is Moth and Evolution Story, which introduces natural selection as the mechanism of evolution to children as young as 4. And you can see, I read it aloud, you see teachers saying, well, the children, they really get it. And also we as educators have kind of understood it properly for the first time. So if you approach a topic, no matter how difficult it might seem from your own past learning it, if you approach it in the right way, you really can tackle any topic for any age group. But I think the thing is to really dive in there and understand that age group and what they're likely to know already, and what you're going to really need to scaffold from them, and what other background knowledge you're going to give them. So you want to look at what's been published in the past, and maybe the school library is a good starting point, but you need to go and spend time in bookshops, but also spend time exploring publishers' resources. So if you're looking at educational publishers, you're wanting to look at their catalogues, not what has come out years and years ago, which we're using in school, but what is coming out right now, what are they promoting right now? And even looking ahead, if you look at rights catalogues, for example, and sales catalogues, you can see what publishers are going to be bringing out in a couple of years' time. So you can sort of see what sorts of direction they're going on. And this is really, really useful background as well. So you're not just relying on outdated resources when you're kind of doing your initial scan of the market.
And how should potential authors ensure they are considering non-native English speakers when writing?
Yeah, I think this is where experience working in international settings and international schools is a massive plus, because everything I write for educational markets and for trade markets too, sometimes for slightly different reasons, which I'll go into in a second. For educational markets, you need to be inclusive for children in different cultural backgrounds. And this often means thinking carefully about how to cover certain subjects, maybe subjects that are considered taboo in certain cultures, to be able to cover them sensitively, because they might not be read, even if you're writing a classroom read or a textbook, there will be occasions where children are reading independently and they might not have an adult on hand to help them kind of interpret the text. So you need to be sensitive about subjects which in certain cultures are very, very difficult and won't be discussed maybe openly in the home. But you also need to think about subjects that might cause total confusion. And that can be sometimes surprising. So I remember working in textbook publishing, there would be always a problem, and we used to publish textbooks for the UK and the US at the same time, and it would always be frowned on when we wanted to either mention or include a picture of an electric kettle, which in the UK is an everyday kitchen item, and it seems it's used by everyone. But in the US, the team would always say, well, no, we don't use kettles here. I didn't really understand, and I didn't fully understand until I actually went to the US myself and saw that they really aren't that common in kitchens, and it's due to the fact that the power supply to homes just makes electric kettles work far more slowly in the UK, so it's not a very attractive option for heating up water. So there's these kind of differences which you can't really understand until you spend time in a different country, in a different culture. But just be aware of those and sort of try and figure them out first, so you don't go too far down one track and your book doesn't totally rely on something which isn't recognised elsewhere. For example, if you're writing about animals, and this has come up when I've been writing library reference books, I wrote a series about animals that live close to humans, and in the UK, hedgehog was fine, but in the US, people don't generally recognise hedgehogs. So in the US, we replaced that with a book on raccoons instead. But again, that would not work in Europe. People just wouldn't see them as everyday sort of animals. So things like that you need to think of when you're planning projects. But also down to the sentence level, in your language that you're using, you want to avoid kind of idioms and colloquialisms that won't be widely understood. Either because your book is going to children who are speaking English as an additional language, so they might not recognize those kind of terms, and they don't want to come across too much in a text that they can't interpret easily. But also because if you're writing books which are likely to be translated, if you're writing books that the kind of books which are going bookshops, which we say, for the trade, which will be sold directly to parents, and they're likely to be widely translated around the world, it's really difficult to translate things like that easily. So that's something that might put off potential publishers if something is very, very localized. But as I say, I think that people working in international schools have a really good awareness of the types of things that might cause issues. So it's a great starting point.
And when thinking about the purpose of your piece, before you begin writing the writing process, do you have a clear idea of this, or does this sort of naturally evolve?
Yeah, I suppose I know when we teach nonfiction writing in schools, we often talk about text types, and we're teaching children, think about the purpose of your text. Are you informing? Are you persuading? Are you discussing here? What are you trying to kind of do with this text type? Now, it's not, I think that's, useful when you're learning to write, but I will tell children this too. I say, well, really, you're kind of trying to do all of these things in one text. You're not just kind of pinning down and following a rigid set of rules, because what you're trying to do with any type of text, whether it's like a sales brochure or it's an essay or, even a kind of reference book, you need to provoke a range of emotions as your reader is reading. It's the only way to keep them interested. And of course, one very famous way to do this is through story. We're all familiar with the story arc. It's kind of embedded in us as we listen to stories as young children. And a story will take us on an emotional journey. But even if you're not writing narrative nonfiction, and your nonfiction is to deliver subject knowledge, you still have to rely on that emotional connection to get the reader to want to read in the first place, and then to get them to retain the information afterwards, to kind of feel that topic's important. So you need to think about your kind of opening, your whole approach to the book. You need to sell that content to the reader. So you're going to need to make a strong emotional connection right from the title onwards. And then on every page, you want them to think, okay, I read the first sentence, this page is worth reading. I'm going to keep on reading it. So you're continually trying to persuade them that this book is worth their time and they shouldn't just close it and go off and play on their games console or something else like that. So sometimes, you might seek to slightly scare them or alarm them. The rising sense of danger or peril is kind of a key thing in a narrative. And, all teachers will kind of know the power of something slightly gross or unexpected, disgusting to get a class's attention. And that can work in writing too. Obviously, you need to think carefully about the age level. You don't want young children to come away really scared and worried about something. So it's about kind of getting the balance right, really. And then every text equally for children will seek to reassure them. You'll notice that the more you explore different types of nonfiction text, you'll notice that kind of whatever happens early on, you'll always kind of come around to a reassuring conclusion. And that's a massive part of any book that I write for young audiences. And it's not just kind of about, over time I found it's not about just giving some kind of reassuring words or facts. I think a lot of it comes down to giving children a real sense of agency. So if you do a book length piece about biodiversity or climate change or the pressures of dealing with friends and the difficult emotions, you can't just kind of give them the content and leave it hanging. You need to provide some kinds of practical steps, some sense to them. They have agency and they have a power to make change in their lives. I think that's what makes a text really satisfying for a young person, where they feel that they can close the book and go off and do something differently in their lives and make a difference. And you've told them what options there are for doing that.
So would you say inspiring them is quite a key purpose, and like you said, to give them agency to act on what they've engaged with in the text? Because I suppose if it's entirely doom and gloom, and then it ends with a sort of a negative note, it's probably not the most not the most inspiring thing for a student or young student, is it?
No, I mean, I think that what you want to be absolutely inspired by your subject anyway, and then I think that really comes through in your writing, because you're then working in all the things that make you very excited about the subject. So hopefully they'll be inspired by the topic, and it's just about adding that extra sense that they have something to offer to the world in this area. And that's obviously going to depend on the subject, but I've noticed that quite a lot of the educational topics I'm writing now, publishers are very keen for children to see how they can get into certain jobs or areas of work, for example, that they may not come across because they haven't got high science capital or haven't got high social capital. They might not come across like family friends and family members working in those jobs. So in a book or in an article, you can kind of fill those gaps and provide information that helps them take those next steps. So there's lots of different ways to inspire. And I think it's about what's kind of appropriate to that subject and that age level. But just assume that children will be more satisfied with your book if there are ways for them to get hands-on and get involved and start doing practical things.
My final opening question is, what kind of opportunities are there for authors?
Yeah, I mentioned first of all that it's a brilliant way to feed back into your own teaching and your subject knowledge, and your own kind of boost your own love of your subject area, if you like. And as a non-fiction author, and especially one who's also got teaching experience, you're so well placed to run, events outside of your own classroom and school and share that extra specialist knowledge you've developed while you write the book. So I love, for example, running workshops and author visits to schools and planning, how my book will work as a kind of live event, like a live version of that book. So I suppose I'm doing almost the opposite of coming from teaching and developing it into book form. And of course, the content's presented very differently, but the two things really support each other. So I think there are a lot of opportunities for leading events once you've kind of started to write nonfiction and educational text. You could be pitching yourself to local schools and places like museums and festivals. You could be running sessions in bookstores and libraries. And events are a really, really nice way to keep in touch with your readers. And also, you kind of come out of an event with loads of new ideas as well. So they really kind of feed to each other. And I'd say also don't just like focus on books. When we use the word author, we think of books. But as you're kind of practicing nonfiction writing, practicing educational writing, you're developing these skills of kind of doing in-depth research. You're finding out a lot about how do you write at the right level for a certain age group? How do you build a story, a piece that kind of both educates and entertains? And these skills are in demand, widely outside book publishing. So companies, charities, organizations, think about who else wants to create resources for young people, children's magazines, science centers. And then of course there's a whole raft of educational websites, blogs and vlogs, so much digital content. So writing all these different kinds and pitching all these different kinds of nonfiction content will help to keep your voice and your ideas fresh. I never say kind of lock yourself away and force yourself to write a book length piece, first of all. There's loads of other ways to reach your audience. If you have an idea that's close to your heart, but you're finding that publishers do not have a demand for it. So for an example from my own career is writing about a child's experience of having a relative with dementia and what that experience is over time and helping them understand the science. And around 2015, I wanted to write about this, but there wasn't a demand from publishers. They thought, well, it's very expensive to produce a book and you have to be sure that there's a very wide audience, and they couldn't necessarily see how they'd reach that audience. But I ended up working with Alzheimer's Research UK, which is a charity, to develop a website for them. So there's lots of ways to get into writing and to work on subjects that are really important to you and reach those readers.
Excellent stuff. Brilliant. And now we move on to your three top tips. So diving straight into your first top tip, Isabel.
Oh yeah, it's really hard to come up with just three, but I was trying to think of things that's most kind of useful as you get started, I suppose, thinking about some like rookie errors, I suppose, that I've seen over time working with other authors. So I think a big challenge that I found when I was starting up in educational writing was that I was worried that if I strayed too far from the texts I was reading as part of my research, from the kind of expert view of a subject, that somehow the content would no longer be accurate enough. So I was very, I obviously have to present my own interpretation of that content, but I was nervous about going too far off piste. And over time, I've really learned to sort of loosen up with my writing, and that doesn't matter, and to really not to mask my unique voice and sort of try and create some generic nonfiction educational voice, but actually quite the opposite, to really bring my own voice to the fore, because that's what's valuable to the publishers, to distinguish my books from those of any other writer. But it's also so valuable for the readers, because it becomes something that's more like a conversation. It becomes a much easier to make an emotional connection on the page if I'm using like my full self and not just my sort of inner, like, well, what should a nonfiction voice sound like? I mean, there is a market for text that could be written by anyone. There's obviously opportunities to write for Wikipedia. There's obviously huge encyclopedia type text where you'd want to be writing in a generic voice. But I think the sooner that you can develop something distinctive which reflects your personality, the better. And that's what's going to make publishers want to use you again and again rather than other writers. So I've been obviously doing this for more than 15 years now, and I tend to work in a number of different author voices. So you can have things like, I don't know if I've got a copy of humorous things like for the Week Junior, or this book, I've only got a copy in Spanish today, but this is called This Book Is Not Rubbish in the UK, and This Book Is Not Garbage in the US, and something that I can't really read in Spanish and Portuguese. My language skills are a bit rubbish, but these are very humorous approach, kind of making jokes, making kind of side comments to try and raise a smile among readers, slightly older readers. And I also write in a style that's very poetic and kind of lyrical picture book style, and that's things like Moth and the follow-up book Fox. If you find a copy of these in the library and have a look, you'll see it's completely different style, using all poetic devices, and a sort of gentle flowing narrative, more of a sort of bedtime or calm read. And then even when I'm writing a chunky old reference text, with up to 100,000 words, something like this book Exploring the Elements, which is really aimed at kind of young teenagers and has a lot of words. It's still not like what you'd find on Wikipedia. I still try and get my excitement across and my wonder at the topic in basically every sentence. And you can see this if you scan reviews, pick any kind of nonfiction writer and have a look at different reviews for their work, and you'll see that reviewers will pick up on the style. One example for This Book Is Not Rubbish, and this was from a Guardian review. The reviewer, Imogen Russell Williams, has written, Isabel writes in a can-do register with an underlying note of steel, in a way that prompts enthusiasm rather than despair. So it's very much, just because you're writing nonfiction doesn't mean that your voice doesn't matter as an author. It's just as important as it is in fiction. And people will pick up on that very quickly. And it will make all the difference to whether people actually want to keep reading the book and then act on what you're saying in the book. So it partly comes with time. You can't sort of shortcut in a way. You need to practice writing, and it doesn't matter if that writing is published or not, just write what you want to write and you'll see your voice emerging. We can feel a bit of a blank page panic and a bit stilted when we start off writing. So sometimes it's easiest to kind of do a chunk of research and then just go and chat with a friend about it, or even better, chat with someone of your target age group. So it might be the children that you teach, for example, or the children in a different class if you're writing for a different level. And you might notice that just when you start talking about the subject area, you start in a very different place than you might if you were trying to start on paper and you were trying to follow conventions. Notice the language that you use. You might even record the conversation if you have permission. Note down the kinds of questions that the people ask. Where are they asking you for more knowledge? Where do you need to put some more content in? What are they most interested in? Where do their eyes light up? Where do they sort of start to glaze a bit and drift off? And then work out how you can bring that into your own work, because that will really help you hit on both what are the best starting points for that subject area, what's the best content in what order, but also what are you injecting in that's kind of unique to you, which is really, really helpful. How do you get your own personality into those explanations? So I think that's a really good starting point.
I really like that around just sort of hearing yourself talk about the subject, and then naturally your voice will start to come through. And I suppose, like you say, if you have the ability to maybe record the conversation with someone of your target audience, then that's amazing opportunity, isn't it? To see how you talk. And then I suppose, is that just a case of practice, and sort of naturally finding your own voice so that you can then think it and then write it rather than have to sort of say it each time? It's just an evolving process, I suppose, right?
Oh, absolutely. And if you're thinking about writing a subject that you already teach, then you'll have honed that over the years. You will have tweaked your own lessons, even if you're repeating the same lesson each year. So you will have done a lot of that work already, and you'll know how to make that immediate connection with your audience. So absolutely use that in your work. Don't feel that you should be imitating another writer whose work you read. Now, you want to read other people's stuff to see what's out there and how people do it, but you don't need to imitate anyone. You want to try and put yourself on the paper so that you can make a connection with your audience in this kind of unique and creative way.
That's a great tip. Brilliant. Well, moving on to your second top tip as well.
So my second tip is sort of connected to this, really, and it's to ask silly questions. And this is a tip I always share when I'm talking to young readers about being a nonfiction writer and how to kind of make their own nonfiction writing experience more interesting. And I would say, like, silly questions are a fantastic starting point. And I make the links with science as well. Scientists as well as writers obviously ask a lot of questions about the world around us. And they can be sensible questions, things like, why is the sky blue? How many legs does an insect have and why? That's great. But I think the silly, unexpected questions are absolutely even better. And so much so that scientists actually have an award every year called the Ig Nobel Prizes, where they sort of reward the funniest, the silliest questions asked and answered by scientists. And it's great fun to go on the Ig Nobel site and have a look at some of these. And it's serious science kind of coming out of it. But questions like, can twins tell themselves apart? Why do older people get bigger ears? Or my absolute favorite, I think, was what is a cat liquid or solid? And it was actually a Nobel winning economist who asked that question, the real Nobel Prize winning economist who asked that question and then went on to answer it, leading to like a fascinating piece of writing that revealed that mathematically cats are in fact liquid, and we start to use that to explain all sorts of elements of cat behavior, especially their kind of crawling into little holes. So if you sort of step away from the sensible types of questions you might find listed on a curriculum, you sort of open up these new avenues for your own research, which also give you new ways into a subject area. And ultimately, it's all about making connections. And that's kind of the source of all creativity, really. You don't need to be the world's best subject expert. You just need to kind of try and tap into that mindset of a really curious child exploring a subject and these things popping into their head. What about that? What about that? And using those to explore the subject in a completely new and creative way. And that kind of curiosity, that's the drive that gets people through writing as well. That's what would make it interesting, because the types of questions that might pop up, there'll be things based on experiences you have. You can only be creative with what you've already absorbed into your own head. And that's going to be based on everything you've done, kind of hobbies, things that you've loved reading about. This can all feed in, and you can use these questions to make connections between those different areas and make that piece of nonfiction writing more personal to you. It works really well with children. It works really well with adult writers as well. And when you're learning to write, but also when you're trying to kind of pep up a certain area and get yourself enthusiastic about writing it. So if you can do that, then I think your enthusiasm comes across more on the page if you're actually excited about it. And of course, as a teacher, you're surrounded by children every day, asking fantastic questions. One of my favorite experiences as a writer has been, for 6 years, I was the kind of science agony aunt for a children's science magazine, answering children's questions, and you just got the most fantastic questions sent on. Things like, I think my favorite was, can dogs swim in ice cream? And it was the jumping off point for a whole article, and it just pushed me to research science I hadn't even thought about before, find out what scientists had done in that area and use that to answer the question. And it's kind of now led questions to this entire whole new book, which is coming out quite soon, next month, called The Bedtime Book of Impossible Questions, which is just kind of full of more than 100 children's different questions, and answering those using science, but also saying, we can't answer everything, but it can be really great fun exploring. And that's a really good starting point for being a writer and a scientist.
That's a great one. And I suppose it goes back to the fundamentals of just science in general, right? I mean, you have the, like you said, the Nobel Prize winner, or, the greatest science in history have been dared to ask those crazy big questions, and then worked it back from there and tried to figure out, why we're here or something in a really sort of, ethereal question. And some may say a crazy question, but actually when you ask those big questions, you can get incredible,
Oh, absolutely.
on the way in.
Yeah, it just makes it much more fun, I think. And I love when I go into schools and say, what, these are some silly questions have been asked before, but you can ask me anything, and every question is valid, and we could go on a kind of adventure together if you start with this question, ask this question. So it's a really nice thing to do, I think, and it leads you into a topic in an unexpected way, which I think is really important, because ultimately when you're pitching work, you're trying to say, this is how my work is different from other people's writing. And that's a really kind of useful way to just to prompt yourself into looking at things differently.
All right, now moving on to your final and third top tip.
Yeah, this is a very practical tip. Just thinking about the sort of support I've given to writers in the past as an editor. So it's to think really hard right from the start about how you research, how you carry out your research, and put certain things in place so that you can be sure your writing is accurate, and you can also be sure you don't plagiarize anyone. Because if you're doing a lot of reading, perhaps over many months, and you're doing it alongside your day job, and you're taking lots and lots of notes, it's easy kind of 6 months later to completely forget where something came from, to even think, maybe I wrote that sentence myself, and then it might end up in the work, and suddenly you've accidentally, subconsciously kind of taken someone else's work, which is obviously something the publishers absolutely want to avoid, so they don't get in huge tangles with copyright law. So rather than focusing entirely on the creative side from the start and thinking I'll sort out the practicalities later, I think it really will pay off if you think hard about getting a system in place for yourself right from the start. So it's going to start with identifying reliable and up-to-date sources for your work. And obviously, this is where your subject knowledge as a teacher is going to come in handy. One rookie error is that people think, well, I'll cast around, I head straight for Wikipedia, but I see that as really bad practice, and I never ever look at Wikipedia. Some people might argue you could use it as a starting point and go to the references and so on, but Wikipedia is another writer's, a combination of writers' work. It is a certain take on a subject, so it's not actually a kind of fully blank sort of free for all. What you need to do is read widely and come up with your own take on a subject, your own sense of what's important and what's going to be important for your reader. So I always avoid Wikipedia together, and I strongly suggest that new writers do as well. It's much more valuable to read original academic articles, to read books on the subject. You know, you could set yourself a couple of months aside to just read widely about a subject, to really get a growing sense of it in your mind. And if you read an interesting article online, for example, and I do often start with kind of desktop-based research, go and find that original research and read it too, because again, an article, even if it's in a kind of like science news site, for example, that's still going to be that journalist's take on that topic. And if you go back and read the original research, you'll find all kinds of gems in there, and you might find that you interpret it slightly different. Better still, interview the author themselves. A lot of people don't know that academics are allowed to share their articles, their journal articles, freely. So even if you don't have access to the expensive academic journals through your institution or a library, you can, if you see something you want to read in full, you are totally free to email the author and ask for a copy, and you can have a chat about the things. That academics are often really keen to sort of share their research. It's part of their own outreach work, and they'd love to kind of see their work written about in other sources. So don't be shy about approaching people for more background on things. Obviously, I'm quite swayed towards science here as the area I write in, but the same goes for other areas of knowledge as well. And I'd insist on always finding 2, if not 3 sources, 3 reputable sources for each fact, and make sure that they're not just sources that are repeating each other. So like one's taken from the other on a web, and they're all kind of like sort of clones of each other on a website. Just try and track down some information, and using print resources as well. You know, even if it's just that you do all your initial research online, and then you say, I'm going to have 1 or 2 library days where I'm going to try and cross-reference everything using books, because I know that they've been kind of researched very thoroughly. So you want to sort of start with that. And the other thing is, you want to be reading quite a couple of levels above the level you're writing for. So if you're writing for primary or elementary students, don't just read things written for primary and elementary students, because again, you're just going to have someone else's sift of the information. You're going to be regurgitating what they've written. What you need to do is be reading a few levels above. Say I'd read, if I was writing for year 6s, I'd probably be reading content that would be taught at A level, for example, and then picking out, getting to know the subject myself before completely rescaffolding it in a way that I think is going to really help the year 6s to understand it at an appropriate level. Also spend some time learning how to use Google search and Google Scholar very thoroughly. So keyword searches, using multiple keywords, using Boolean search operators. You know, you really need to kind of develop those skills, and it only takes about a morning of reading to get hugely different search results from everyone else. And then that's another really good way to kind of speed up the process really and drill down to what you want. And it's obviously a lot of reading. And I know I said before, it can be easy to kind of get really into the reading, go down these kind of internet wormholes and take out little notes or copy and paste. And suddenly you've got this big tangle of words in a document and you don't know where they come from. So I would always get some kind of template for note taking, both so that you can refer back, you can refer editors back in the future, you can refer readers back who, you know, email once the book is published saying, oh, what about this? Can I just ask a question about this? You can always refer back and know exactly where you found a piece of information. And it also makes sure you don't plagiarize your original source by separating your own words and ideas from those notes that you've taken as you're researching. So I'm going to show you now a sort of example, if you like, of a template that I've used to sort of structure the notes that I take. It's partly based on the note-taking methods I learned when I was doing my postgraduate research as well. And over time, you probably develop your own structure, you know, what you feel is most important. There are a lot of different systems. In the past, I've tried out things like color coding different subject areas using footnotes and so on. You can record references as comments and give your work in Google Docs or in Word. But overall, I find it really helpful to work like this reading record and to use different spaces on the page to record different types of information, starting, of course, with full details of the resource itself. So title, author, the date it's published, the date you read it, and where you found it. So if it's a web link or a library code, this can save hours of kind of searching time later on. And then it's a really good idea to write a summary of what's in there. And obviously that comes after you've read as much of that resource as you want to read. Just write yourself a 2-line summary of what are the key facts and ideas and themes you've found in that text, just to jog your memory. And then you might take your notes in whatever style you like to. I often either bold or underline direct quotes that I might want to use, so I don't get them kind of mixed up with different materials. And then in a completely separate place, I'll jot down my own ideas. So obviously, as you're reading and you're exploring a subject, you'll get brilliant, you might get phrases pop in your head, you might get connections of other things and things you want to include in the text, and ideas of kind of mini stories or sort of flows of information, fact boxes. And you need to jot that down separately from your notes, just so you can keep those two things separated out, but then easily sort of join them together when it comes to writing the book. And this is another really good way to avoid plagiarizing someone else's work. If you just keep them separated out, keep your notes documents separate, and only start to bring them together in a separate draft manuscript document. And then I also, you'll see it right at the end, I've jotted down a space to follow up on things that I've read in the text. So those silly questions that are popping into my mind as I'm reading that particular reference source, I'll note down here, and it will help me kind of go on to the next stage of my research. So obviously, you know, it depends what I'm researching and in what depth, how much of that I fill in, but it could be a really helpful starting point for people who are quite new to writing to develop that sort of discipline in their note taking. Yeah, so I hope those tips are helpful.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, I mean, research and not ensuring you're not plagiarizing, that's sort of key parts of the writing process, aren't they? And I especially like what you mentioned about, you know, if there's a particular text or source that you're interested in, and maybe you want to sort of dive a bit deeper, to just email the author directly and just to start a conversation. That's a really interesting piece of advice. And you've done that, have you, a couple of times and heard back?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, one of the publications I write for is the Week Genius Science and Nature, which is a children's science magazine, and every article I've written has involved, you know, the research is involved interviewing an expert, an academic working in that area and feeding that into the article. I've interviewed all kinds of people. I remember interviewing a stunt woman who worked in Hollywood, and I got such job envy because that job was amazingly fun and just so different from kind of sitting writing at a desk. I've written whole books on kind of different weird and wonderful careers. I interviewed a penguinologist who worked at Oxford University, and you know, he was talking about going out and all the different ways that you monitor penguins and the smell of the penguins and stuff you'd never get from just reading kind of written reference materials. So it's fantastic, and people are so happy to talk about their jobs and their research. It's not like, you know, they've all got time to kind of go off and start writing for young people themselves, so no one minds at all about sharing. And then you credit them, and then often with like a copy of the resource that you've produced, and it kind of counts towards their own outreach kind of evidencing. So they're always really happy to talk about things.
Great stuff. And the only downside is that it might make you want to change your career, I suppose.
Yeah. Too late to be a stunt person now, but
brilliant stuff. All right, moving on to my last question, or sort of actually an ISN members last question. So the last question is submitted from a member of our community, and the question is, what are some good tools or digital apps that would help someone starting academic writing?
Yeah, so I suppose academic writing is slightly different. I'm thinking of educational writing, and that's my sort of area. I have had limited experience of academic writing, writing for other academics to read, but I'm just going to focus on sort of educational writing. So either writing for other educators to read or writing for young audiences to read in educational settings. And I'd say in that situation, you really don't need more than either, you know, Google Docs or Word or a similar word processing program. You obviously would ideally need access to good internet connection, I suppose, an understanding of how to use Google, and particularly Google Scholar, beyond what the everyday sort of person does when they're researching, is really helpful. But again, that's free. There are a lot of apps and programs out there which are pitched at writers, which offer to kind of offer scaffolds or note-taking or sort of, I don't know, time structuring, maybe claim to kind of offer motivation, but I actually don't use any of those things. When I was writing as a postgraduate researcher, I was using Envivo, which is really handy for kind of logging academic papers and keeping notes. But over time, I found that I actually wanted my notes together in a separate document. So I moved towards something more like my homemade template, which I showed you earlier, because I don't want to have to be like opening multiple kind of apps to find my notes and sort of searching through. So I like one document for my notes and kind of fledgling ideas, and one document as my kind of working plan, if you like, which I then use as a template for the manuscript itself. So really a very simple setup. If you can get yourself registered as a member of an academic library, as you know, maybe through an old institution, maybe through different partnerships, or even going to your local public library and saying, can I register for access to certain journals? That can be really, really helpful. But as I say, sometimes you can get a quick overview of what's in a journal article via Google Scholar. And if you're really, really curious to read the rest of it, then email the author of the article and ask if they can send you a copy, which they're allowed to do and are often just really happy to do. So it's a low barrier to entry, really. And the key thing is not getting loads of expensive equipment or expensive workstation in place or waiting for the perfect time. It's just to kind of write and pitch and get used to doing that and kind of demystify it in your own mind, and learn to sort of not take it personally if an idea is not right for a publisher or an editor at that time, but just to kind of keep on showing enthusiasm, keep on sending ideas, and that will very much get you in their minds. I remember that a lot of educational texts, much more so than in trade publishing, and by trade publishing I mean for bookshops, for kind of the consumer who will walk into shops, educational publishing tends to be largely commissioned direct from the editor. So the ideas will be developed in-house, and then they'll start to think, well, who would be a good writer for this? So if you can start sending information about yourself, not like reams and reams, no one wants your whole life story, but just send them examples of things you've already written, send them a letter explaining which subjects you're really enthusiastic about and why you'd be a great writer and why you're keen to do this, then you'll be sort of top of their mind when they come to commissioning in that subject area. So I think it's just all about getting started. The sooner the better, and don't worry too much about being perfect, and be a little bit kind of take all that. There's a big industry built up around publishing, which is about selling tips, selling advice, and selling tools, but you actually don't need a lot of that. So take everything with a pinch of salt, and be quite selective about what you take, and realize that in the end it's just about spending the time getting the writing done, and pitch all the time, and not getting too attached to one idea.
Love that message. Yeah, I think it's great that, it's just the idea is the important part, isn't it? Is if you have an idea, you don't need all these technical tools and all this sort of stuff, really. The main thing is to have the idea, to get out there, start talking about the subject, see how you sort of communicate naturally. Do the research, and then just get writing. Fundamentally, yeah, fantastic, brilliant. Thank you so much, Isabel. That was fascinating, and really, I know that these tips are going to be so useful for our members and the wider community that are keen to get started in writing. and becoming authors. So thank you once again for your time. Great conversation, and
Thank you so much.
as well.
Good luck, everyone.